looking, throwing in the end zone. Caught it! Montana, touchdown, John Taylor.
Young to the air, Young to Jerry Rice, touchdown San Francisco.
Young stumbles on the way back and fires up the middle. Pass is caught by Owens.
Hello and welcome to the 49ers Plus podcast. I'm your host, Al Moriello, and this is your source for the most objective 49ers discussion and analysis, plus timely and entertaining sports and pop culture topics. And today we're going to be talking about the 49ers signing a tight end. We will discuss that impact, a really bad take by an ESPN analyst on the future of Brandon Aiyuk with the team. And as part two of our draft prep and analysis, we're going to be discussing offensive line and defensive line, looking at who's on the roster, who's under contract beyond this year, and what some potential draft targets could be in the first couple rounds. In the plus section, I'm going to give my thoughts on both the men's and women's Final Fours in college basketball, the NAIA banning transgender women in sports. I have some thoughts there as well. And I recently just read the Avengers versus X-Men comic from about a decade ago. Just want to share a review with you. But like always, it starts with the Niners. So let's get right into it.
Let's talk Niners.
So after the 49ers lose out on a tight end from the Detroit Lions. Lions matched a 3-year offer. The 49ers came to terms with tight end Eric Saubert on a 1-year deal. This will be his age 30 season, so obviously not looking to be a replacement or a long-term complement to George Kittle, at least not initially. We'll see how this year goes if he even sticks on the roster. Saubert is 6'5", 253 pounds. Last season, he was with the Dolphins, Cowboys, and Texans. Last year, 3 receptions for 12 yards among those 3 teams. His best receiving season. And that's really what we should be looking for here. A more all-around tight end 2. His best season was in 2022 with the Broncos. 15 receptions for 148 yards and 1 score. By contrast, Charlie Werner, former tight end 2 who signed with the Atlanta Falcons this offseason, 3 years, $12 million. In his 4 years as a San Francisco 49er, 11 catches for 120 yards. So while 15 for 148 and a score is modest production in a season, still beats out what Werner did over the course of 4 seasons. It would be nice if Saubert sticks on the roster, because there's no guarantee that he does, that if it's him or whoever attains that role, between 22 and 30 catches from a tight end 2 would be nice, not out of the ordinary. Of course, that's predicated on George Kittle coming off the field a bit more, but getting, even if it is 15 for 148, that's not quite a catch a game. Let's go 17 for 160. Still better than what they've gotten the past couple years, but not really at the production that I'm hoping for from the tight end 2 spot. But this is not, and nor should it, prevent the 49ers from drafting a tight end, 2.5 weeks from now when the draft kicks off. Is Eric Saubert a camp body? Could there be, well, there will definitely be other tight ends released later on during training camp, final cuts. I mean, there could be someone, if Saubert doesn't make a good impact, if it looks like Hamlet 2 or Braden Willis isn't stepping up, that they bring another veteran type of a tight end. But beyond that, I would anticipate them using a draft pick within the first 4 rounds of the draft. They're going to need to bring in maybe 6, 7 tight ends for training camp. Let's say 6. So it could be, You have Saubert, you have a drafted tight end, maybe an undrafted player comes in at the tight end position as well. Big question really being, will Cameron Latou step up? Remember, he started his career at Alabama on defense. Switched over to tight end, had a good last, say, year and a half at tight end, is physical, will block, just had a major case of the dropsies, which then masqueraded into a knee meniscus issue, which very well might have been the case, but it could have been a knee sprain, tweak, boo-boo, that the Niners called a meniscus injury and they put him on IR for the year. Shanahan might have, and the offensive staff clearly felt that Latou was not ready, so they essentially redshirted him. But the Niners bringing in a veteran tight end, if nothing else, should help out with blocking, but seems like right off the bat will give more receiving ability than Charlie Werner ever did, and could be a player that could push Latou, Braden Willis for the tight end 2 spot, or potentially a rookie coming in. Now let's stay on the offensive side of the ball, and let's stay with pass catchers. I recently read and listened to a really awful take by ESPN analyst Matt Miller. Grew up a 49er fan, covers the 49ers in addition to other teams in the league. And, what he initially said, I agree with. The idea that a team really shouldn't be paying 2 receivers, $24, $25 million plus. It's tough. It's tough when Brock Purdy is going to get a significant raise after this season. Just a matter of, is he going to go from making a little over $1 million a year to a little over 40, 45, 50? Which obviously changes the financial structure of the team per position group. But it's not that, so while, the fundamental approach, I agree with, you shouldn't long-term have 2 players making a lot of money. You saw it the past couple years with the Chargers, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. Now both are gone. But I think they went a little nuts with that. They decided to keep both Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack on the defensive side of the ball. Both took some slight restructures and pay cuts, but then flat out traded Keenan Allen and released Mike Williams. They probably could have kept one as some sort of security blanket or familiar offensive weapon for Justin Herbert. No, both of those are gone. And it is really hard to come up with a team that's going to pay 2 receivers that much money. I mean, maybe the closest, you have DK Metcalf making about $25 million. Tyler Lockett and he was re-signed or extended by the Seahawks, wasn't making nearly that much. The Eagles have Devontae Smith coming up to pair with their all-pro wide receiver. On the other end, we'll see how much they can afford there because Jalen Hurts did get the bag at quarterback. Jamar Chase hasn't gotten paid yet in Cincinnati. Tyler Boyd's a free agent. T. Higgins is franchised, who could still be traded. Stephon Diggs is going to the Texans. I mean, I'm sure I'm forgetting a host of other teams that have superstar receivers. I mean, the Vikings lost Cousins, right? You lose, $35 million of salary. You bring in Sam Darnold at quarterback for $10 million. You have Jordan Addison on a rookie contract at receiver. So you can afford to pay Justin Jefferson if he's going to get, $32, $33, $35 million. Jalen Waddle is up for an extension after giving Tyreek Hill $30 million. And then they're looking to pay Tua, and there's contract negotiations there. You guys get it. It's not impossible. It would have been much easier if both Aiyuk and Deebo got paid 2 years ago, right? When the Niners didn't actually at that point know what they had in Purdy, but they still had Trey Lance on a rookie deal. Now you have to play the 2, 3, 4 years out game. But getting back to Matt Miller, and here's where we're getting into the bad take. He made a statement that San Francisco made their choice in 2022 between the two receivers when they signed Deebo. Okay, so first off, they signed Deebo to a 3-year deal. He's signed through 2025. That is not hamstringing the 49ers' future in any way, shape, or form when you look at the amount of money that Brock Purdy is going to get in about a year's time. And here's a quote from Matt Miller. Quote, "I think wide receiver is one of those positions where you can get immediate impact from a rookie. There's guys, first round, second round, third round, who come in and are great players." Well, can you guarantee that? The Niners went through this similar exercise a couple years ago, 2020, between Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner. You trade one, you draft a defensive tackle in Javon Kinlaw. Did not work out. If they had chosen a different D tackle, it might have worked out, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get. Are there good players coming out in the first and second rounds? Sure. But you can't guarantee it. You have a known quantity in Brandon Aiyuk. No one in the draft this year, and this is a year that's heavy on receivers coming out of college, no one, there might not be a player that becomes a Brandon Aiyuk, right? That's always possible. But let's go back. So this past draft, for every Zay Flowers, nice rookie year. Jordan Addison, nice rookie year. Rashee Rice, nice rookie year. You have 5 receivers drafted in the first 2 rounds that were mediocre or worse. Not to say that they can't become something, but when you're the 49ers and you're in a championship window, and this actually might be the last year where most or all of the stars or Pro Bowl players are kept together because of Purdy's contract, among others, being $23 million over the cap next year. As of today, with only 38 players signed, not accounting for Aiyuk's deal or Purdy's deal, they're going to have to make some decisions. Now, 2022, you had some great receivers at the top. Garrett Wilson of the Jets, Chris Olave from the Saints, and then you had 10 other receivers in the first 2 rounds that were So that's what? You're going 2 for 12 there? You went 3 for 8 in 2023. And remember, Danny Gray in 2022 was a 3rd-round receiver. And Matt Miller saying you can get great receivers in the first, second, or 3rd round. Yeah, you can. Generally, if you're in the top half of the 1st round, you have a better chance of that happening than anywhere else. Niners didn't get a great receiver in Danny Gray in the 3rd. And 2021, you had Jamar Chase, Cincinnati, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith of the Eagles versus 7 players. So there you're 3 for 10. So your best year, you went 3 for 8, then 3 for 10, then 2 for 12. So what are we saying that really is? Like 25%, 30% maybe chance of hitting on a good receiver within the first 3 years? Because I went back to 2021, right? Chase, Waddle, and Smith versus 7, And that's 3 years worth of tape. I think we can safely say that those 7 receivers are middling. Not a great hit rate, right? Not a great hit rate. Obviously, when you have a known quantity, someone who the last 2 years, Aiyuk was, I think, at 1,100 yards. Last year, 2 years ago, 1,300 yards. This year, both years, when you compare him to Deebo Samuel's production, he outperformed Deebo's receiving and rushing yards combined. Aiyuk had more. Deebo, I think, had more touchdowns, but obviously he's getting some of the touches within inside the 20 with sweeps and running plays, etc. Not minimizing what he brings to the table. He's just not a number 1 receiver. I think we can all agree on that. But there was no mention at all. One, Matt Miller, the Niners made their choice with Deebo. All right, he's not signed for 7 years, dude. He's not signed until 2030. He's signed until 2025. This year and next season. But there was no mention at all. It was only about not paying Aiyuk or trading Aiyuk. Nothing about trading Deebo. Come on, man. If you're working for an ESPN and an analyst and this is your favorite team, I need a little bit more thinking than that. If 2025 is Deebo's last year under contract, why, Matt Miller, did you not mention extending Aiyuk? So then you have Aiyuk and Deebo this year. Again, probably their last best chance of making a Super Bowl run for probably the next 5 years. And then trading Deebo after this season so you can save, depending on when a trade happens, either $10 million or $17 million on the cap. That just depends on if he's traded before or after June 1st. It's an understandable take from the get-go with not paying 2 receivers. I get it. But if you're not going to dig in and problem solve and figure out what's best for this team, is it easier to find an Aiyuk or a gadget Deebo player? Is it easier to find a number 1 receiver like Brandon Aiyuk or a number 2 receiver like Deebo Samuel? In both instances, the answer is easier to find the Deebo replacement. Deebo is a special, singular talent. And even, the 3 games that he missed, the Niners lost him, and that's how important he is. That's because Kyle's game plan is too Deebo-centric in a way that when Deebo's out, there is no one behind him to take his place, which is why I mentioned last podcast, 3 or 4 receivers that could emulate Deebo, not only for this year if Deebo misses time, but in 2025 when I think he'll be off the roster. Harder to replace Aiyuk than Deebo. Deebo's the bigger name, flashier player, does more with the ball in his hand, can get the ball, number of different ways. Aiyuk's more important to the passing game. So now let's stick with offense and let's talk offensive line, who's on the roster and some players they may be looking for in the first couple rounds in the draft. So there are currently 11 players on the roster on the offensive line that really have a chance of making the roster. Then there's 3 other players that are going to be practice squad at best candidates. But your starters, same as ended the season: Trent Williams, Aaron Banks, Jake Brendel, John Feliciano, and Colton McKivitz. Let's break it down by position. Tackles. Obviously, Williams at left tackle, Colton McKivitz at right tackle. Jalen Moore is the swing tackle, and they brought in Brandon Parker from the Raiders, who has some experience, has had some trouble staying healthy, but it's easier to stay healthy when you're a backup than when you're starting. Should he make the team, less will be asked of him. But let's look at the tackles. Trent Williams, 35, going to be 36. Maybe he just plays this year. Maybe he plays 2024 and 2025, but you have to start thinking ahead. Colton McKivitz signed to an extension in 2025, so you have him at least for 2024 and 2025. But behind that, Jalen Moore, who is going to be the first tackle off the bench right now if they don't draft anybody. 2024 is the last year of his contract. Brandon Parker was only signed for 2024, so those 2 very well may be gone after this season. Guards. Aaron Banks, starting at left guard, last year of his contract. John Feliciano, started at right guard, only 1 year contract. Ben Barch, who I like as a backup, only a 1 year contract. Then you have Spencer Burford, 2 years left, and Nick Zakiel, 2 years left. Neither one of those do we want to see in any sort of starting capacity, but they could also be bumped by a more promising draft pick. So at guard, the Niners may be down 3 guards after this season. Centers, Jake Brendel, I believe, has 2 years left on his deal. Corey Luciano, second-year player out of Washington, signed a 1-year deal. So that's a lot, guys. A lot of players. Of the 11 I mentioned, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, more than half. 2024 is the last year of the deal. Does not mean the Niners can't re-sign them. Does not mean that if they don't, sign or find gems in the draft, that all is going to be lost, because after the 2024 season, they're going to be signing folks of any position, but we're talking about offensive line too, 1-year deals or multiple year deals. all is not lost, but knowing that you have that many players coming off the books after 2024, that's when the draft becomes more important. But before we get into potential draft players, if you're thinking about players that could get cut and freeing up money, really the only ones with a hit on the cap, meaning if they released them, they would owe some money. Basically, everybody else, Nick Sakiel, Brandon Parker, they would basically owe next to nothing. Spencer Burford has a 1.15 at guard, $1 million cap hit. 336,000 on the books if he gets cut. They save 817,000. And Ben Barch signed a $1.125 million 1-year deal. The Niners would be on the hook for 302,000 on the cap if he's cut, but they would save 822. Again, so those are the players that the Niners would owe the most on the cap should they get rid of them. Not to say that those are not large amounts of money combined. It's about $640,000. That's peanuts if both don't make the team. But just wanted to share that. Now, I'm going to go over some possible offensive and defensive lineman selections, but I'm not playing the trade-up game. I'm not projecting trade up, trade back. There's probably going to be more trading up than trading back since the Niners have 10 draft picks and 10 rookies will not make the roster. But for now, if they just staying at 31, players that could be available to them on the offensive line. So let's start with offensive tackle Tyler Guyton out of Oklahoma, 6'8", 322. Of the three tackles I'm going to mention, he has the least experience, but can play both sides. Jordan Morgan, Arizona, 6'5", 311, tore his ACL in 2022. Lot of starting experience at right tackle. Tore his ACL in 2022, came back, wanted to prove that he was healthy last year. He did that. Might be the most athletic tackle of the three, and maybe in the draft. There's some people saying that, his arms might be might not be long enough to play tackle. He could play guard. If he doesn't beat out Colton McKivitz at right tackle this year, but he's a better guard than John Feliciano, sure, he can play guard. But no one is going to draft Jordan Morgan and automatically make him a guard. It's not going to happen. Athletic tight ends with a lot of starting experience, with a lot of talent traits, size, speed, being able to sink hips, being able to have a strong core and base, move your feet, left side, right side, depending on what side tackle you're going to be. Jordan Morgan has all that. Is he a perfect prospect? No, but there's no perfect prospect in this draft. Regardless of position, he's going to be a tackle. And then finally, Kingsley Sumataya of BYU, 6'5", 326, has played left tackle and right tackle. He's a mauler. He could refine his punch, and his block sets, his pass sets a little bit more, but he's someone that could potentially slide into guard if needed, if he is not a starter. But to me, round one is offensive line. If the Niners took any one of these tackles, because again, no one's beating out Trent Williams. One of them might be the heir apparent to Trent Williams on the left-hand side. But even if they can't beat out McKivitz, this prospect could be the swing tackle, beat out Jalen Moore, could be a starting right guard. Should they, challenge John Feliciano or even Aaron Banks on the left-hand side and provide help on the interior. This is not just a one position and go situation. Adds flexibility. Now, let's talk about centers and guards. Someone who could fall to them, center Jackson Powers Johnson out of Oregon, 6'3", 328, only one full year of starting at Oregon, but had a highly decorated year in the Pac-10. Nasty center, could transition to play guard as well, but if he gets drafted, I would imagine he would immediately start over Jake Brendel, and maybe Brendel battles for one of the guard positions, or he would be the first man up reserve, either guard or center. And then lastly, someone who started out who was a tackle in college, but is going to be more of a guard or center in the pros. Graham Barton out of Duke, 6'5", 313, has tackle experience. So should the Niners draft him and be in a pinch due to injuries or whatnot during a game, he could slide out and play tackle. Remember, there was that one game, was it against the Ravens on Christmas night, or something happened with injuries and Spencer Burford was at tackle, and he's equally bad at right tackle as he is at right guard. So Barton, again, has that a little bit more he has more outside flexibility than Jackson Powers Johnson does. But another player that could be there, at pick 31 to help shore up the line. Now, when we get into rounds 2 through 4, I'm just going to go through this quickly. Some offensive tackles the Niners could be looking at. Patrick Paul out of Houston, big tackle, 6'7", 331, has played a lot of football. Blake Fisher at Notre Dame, 6'6", 310, and Roger Rosengarten for Washington, 6'5", 308, one of the tackles on what was really proclaimed the nation's best offensive line. So should the Niners eschew a tackle or an offensive lineman in the first round, I don't think they're going to go tackle and guard rounds 1 and round 2. I just think that would be overkill. I could see, or I could very easily see a tackle being taken in the first round, and maybe in the latter rounds 4 or 5, a center/guard person to help fortify the interior as being a possibility. And those guards or centers that could be coming off the board in rounds 2 to 4, Cedric Van Pran from Georgia, Dominic Puny from Kansas, Christian Mahogany from Boston College, and Zach Zinter from Michigan. So I'm not going to give full rundowns on potential mid-round players, but seeing where the Niners are, and again, this is assuming that they're drafting the latter portions of the first, second, third, or fourth. Maybe, they can pick up somebody a little bit sooner with one of their compensatory picks. I don't recall exactly how late they appear in the third, fourth, and sixth rounds. But those are some players to keep an eye on if you're going to be watching as much of the draft as I probably unfortunately am. But remember, let's just go back to the top. There's 11 currently on the roster that have a chance at making the team. They're going to draft 2. So that's 13 players that have 53-man ability, and they're only keeping 9. You have to keep 8 per the NFL. You have to, your 53-man roster, your active roster on game days has to have your 5 starters and 3 backups on it. The Niners are not only going to go with 8, and I don't think they're going to go to 10. So I think 9 is going to be the realistic sweet spot. You have your 5 starters and 4 backups. So I can see the Niners drafting 2 offensive linemen, getting them to 13. That could make the 53-man roster, and needing to trim 4. Maybe there's someone that's tradable. I don't know. But that's how I think the numbers game is going to shake out on the offensive line. Now, defensive line, they currently have 14 players on their roster that have a shot at making the 53. Defensive line, so between tackles and edge, defensive ends, they're going to keep 9 or 10. So right off the bat, 4 or 5 without even dipping into the draft. And they're going to draft a defensive lineman. It's just a matter of, to me, I guess, how many? No more than 2, again. So if you get to 16, you're going to have to cut 6 or 7 players. And maybe, again, trades could potentially be a possibility to get something for someone that, if they're released, you might have to be in a waiver order, or, like the whole Malik Collins thing. We're going to get into that in a second. The Niners threw a 7th round pick at the Texans. They were going to release him. They guaranteed themselves Malik Collins in replacement of Eric Armstead. But here's who your starters are: Nick Bosa, Javon Hargrave, Malik Collins, and Leonard Floyd. Let's break it down by position. Defensive ends on the roster, there are 7. Nick Bosa, Leonard Floyd, Yetur Gross-Matos, Drake Jackson, Robert Beal, Austin Bryant, and Ernest Brown the fourth. All right, so Floyd and Gross Matos obviously were brought in free agency, 2-year deals. I don't think they're going anywhere. They're definitely not going anywhere. Drake Jackson, been disappointing, finished the year on injured reserve, has 2 years left on his deal. I think the Niners would like to see him stick on the roster, but at the same time, they haven't seen enough from him, which is why they dipped into the free agent market and brought 2 defensive ends in. Robert Beal, a rookie last year, a defensive end that had one of, if not the quickest get-offs from the snap in college football, was a 5th-round pick. Didn't play much, but they probably like the upside. They like the promise. Austin Bryant last year was signed as a free agent, was on the practice squad for the majority of the year, has started in the league for the Detroit Lions, and Ernest Brown has starting experience with the Rams. The last 2 players, Austin Bryant and Ernest Brown, both are on 1-year deals. So if the Niners do nothing in the draft at defensive end and people stay healthy and they don't trade anybody, they have 5 DNs, Bosa, Floyd, Gross Matos, Drake Jackson, and Robert Beal on their roster through at least 2025. Defensive tackles, they have 7, again, that I could possibly make the 53. Javon Hargrave, Malik Collins, Jordan Elliott, Kevin Givens, Kalia Davis, T.Y. McGill, and Spencer Wage. So a couple things. Let's break down the D tackles for a second. So obviously Collins and Jordan Elliott came aboard. They are both signed through 2025, so the next 2 seasons. Kevin Givens has been with the 49ers for, I think, 4 years, re-signed with them 1 year, $2 million, basically fully guaranteed. So they get no cap relief if they cut Kevin Givens. He is basically making the team as their 4th or 5th defensive tackle, unless they draft 2 D tackles and they blow the Niners away and they're able to potentially, flip Kevin Givens for, say, a 7th-round pick or a flip of 7th-round picks. Kalia Davis is going to be his 3rd year, so 2 years left, has not shown much, cannot stay healthy. T.Y. McGill has been on the practice squad the past couple years, and Spencer Wage is a 2nd-year player out of North Dakota State. McGill and Wage both on 1-year deals. Could the Niners stand to beef up their defensive line even more? Yes, and for the simple reason of the run defense was not great second half of last year. They jettisoned Eric Armstead, Javon Kinlaw, Sebastian Joseph Day. Then they're bringing in, 2 new bodies in Collins and Jordan Elliott, bringing Kevin Givens back. And then I think they're going to draft a defensive tackle. I do. And I think what's going to really make them eye up a defensive tackle as early as the 1st round, although I'd prefer the 2nd because I do think the Niners need an offensive tackle. Javon Hargrave. Now, had a pretty good season. Right? I think he had, 7.5 sacks for San Francisco. Not the biggest defensive tackle, going to be 31 years old. They can get out of Hargrave's contract with not a ton owed, or not a ton that would hit the cap after the 2024 season. And remember, the Niners, like I said, $24 million over the cap for 2025 with only 38 players signed to the roster. Hargrave could be a cap casualty. Again, it's just a matter of pre or post June 1st, but either way, much like trading Deebo at the end after the 2024 season, they can realize significant cap relief. And if that's a possibility, then let's get a body in this year. Let's get a body in this year that could play some, be part of that 4 or 5 man defensive tackle rotation, and assume a bigger role in 2025 if Javon Hargrave is not on the team. Now, not something I'm hoping for, but I think these are, as the Niners have a good problem like a lot of teams do. You have a lot of Pro Bowl, all-pro players. They are going to want to get paid what the market says they are worth. You just can't pay everybody. And with Hargrave, and if he has another good year, between like 5 and 7 sacks, maybe they can work something out, restructure his contract or rip up his contract and give him something else where, maybe he gets more guaranteed money, but it's less of a hit the next couple of years. you could rip up a contract. Stephon Diggs and the Texans ripped up Diggs' contract after he was traded and made it a 1-year deal, and the Texans gave him a little bit more money in 2024 than he would have gotten on his previous deal. You can rip it up. It's not just a restructure, guys. A rip up and creation of a new contract is a thing with someone like Hargrave, who could be a productive player, just a little bit older. He's been healthy, and if he's healthy again in 2024, I think it'll make for an interesting discussion for 49ers management. But getting to the draft now, round 1, if the Niners were to select a defensive tackle, who could they pick? So out of Michigan, defensive tackle Chris Jenkins. If that name's familiar, it's because his father, Chris Jenkins, was a D tackle for the Panthers in the early 2000s. But the younger Jenkins out of Michigan, 6'3", 299 is a possibility. Devondre Sweat out of Texas, 6'4", 366, huge. Now, he is the defensive tackle that was stopped for a DWI. The blood alcohol level was higher than it legally should have been. Fine, not the greatest look in the world, but it's not like Jalen Carter, who the Eagles drafted last year in the first round, the defensive tackle, who was basically an accessory to some sort of vehicular manslaughter. DWIs are, I'm not minimizing it. That's not cool, because that could lead to vehicular manslaughter. But I would not push Devondre Sweat, who was the Outland Trophy winner, top defensive lineman in the nation. And if you want to talk about adding more beef on the line, he'd be 50 pounds heavier than anyone else that they have on the line currently. And then lastly, although he'll be there at the end of the first round, I don't necessarily know if he's a first-round pick, but defensive tackle Braden Fisk out of Florida State, 6'4", 292, high motor person, but, not as big as Eric Armstead, because Armstead was 6'6", 6'7", 290. Fisk is 6'4", 292. I don't know if the Niners want to go a bit more stout, a bit shorter and heavier, more of like a fire plug type of build and approach to stopping the run, and just hoping that their defensive ends are the ones that are kind of Hargrave are the ones that are going to be generating pressure. But Fisk could be there in the first round. Of the three, I don't think Fisk is my third choice. Now, defensive ends, which again, it's a possibility. Niners like defensive players, but Bosa and Floyd are your starters. Could someone come in and leapfrog you to Gross Matos or Drake Jackson? Sure. But you're looking at, DN number 3, maybe number 4 at best. Just like with D tackles in the first round. Hargrave and Collins are the starters. They gave Jordan Elliott $5 million a year, and they like Kevin Givens. He knows the system. So if you're drafting a defensive tackle in the first round, remember, that's D tackle 4, probably at best. But defensive ends, who could be there? The first one I kind of doubt, but Chop Robinson out of Penn State, 6'3", 254. NFL.com dubs him a boom or bust type of prospect. And Darius Robinson out of Missouri, 6'5", 285 as DNs Niners could look at in the first round, although I highly, highly, highly doubt, even if Robinson is there, that they would draft a defensive end in the first. But it could be that a team wants to maybe jump up and draft, Chop Robinson or someone at defensive tackle, and the Niners want to move out of the first round. Although, remember, you move out of the first round, you lose out on the 5th-year option that helps keep a good ascending player under your control for an extra year. Never say never, but those are potential first-round D tackles and D ends. In rounds 2 through 4, you've got defensive tackles Mason Smith out of LSU, Leonard Taylor out of Miami, Dwayne Carter from Duke, and McKinley Jackson out of Texas A&M. Built again like that fire plug that I mentioned earlier, 6'1", 326. More of a true nose tackle, but could fill the role that Collier Davis was unable to fill on the defensive line. Definitely much more of a run stuffer than a pass rusher. And at defensive ends, rounds 2 through 4, potentially Marshawn Kneeland from Western Michigan, 6'3", 267. in the same kind of height, weight mold as a Nick Bosa, Braylon Trice out of Washington, 6'3", 245, more of a speed rusher. Austin Booker, same out of Kansas, 6'4", 240, and Adisa Isaac, Penn State, 6'4", 247. I think defensive tackle in the first 3 rounds, preferably, first 4 rounds, 2, 3, or 4, is going to be a bit more of a need because I think this feels like the last year for Javon Hargrave. The Niners have invested in Bosa, have invested in Floyd, brought Gross Matos in, still are hoping on Drake Jackson. Robert Beal they like, but he is a 5th round pick. I think if you had to put a gun to my head and said which defensive line position will the Niners draft first, there's no guarantee they're going to draft both. I think they are, just a matter of what rounds. I think they'll draft defensive tackle first. That concludes the 49ers section of the podcast. Stick around. I have thoughts on both Final Fours, men's and women's, the NAIA banning transgender women in sports. I have some thoughts there. And Avengers versus X-Men comic from 2012 that I recently read. Want to share a review with you. Stick around.
It's plus time.
So congratulations to South Carolina and UConn for winning the women's and men's college basketball championships respectfully. Let's start with some ratings from the women's Final Four and final. So UConn, Iowa, the much anticipated Caitlin Clark, Paige Beckers matchup. 14.2 million women watched that game, making it the highest rated women's college basketball game or pro basketball game of all time, only to be eclipsed in the championship game. South Carolina, Iowa did an 18.87 million number. That is a 90% increase over the title game from 2023. By comparison, this year, the men's final, UConn-Purdue, was watched by 14.82 million people at some point. 4 million people more tuned in to watch the women's championship game, which I think is absolutely awesome. And it was South Carolina, Iowa, the most watched basketball game of any kind, women's, men, college, pros, in the last 5 years. That is absolutely fantastic. It goes to show the growth of women's basketball, the growth of women's sports, the star power that was on display in the Final Four between UConn, Iowa, South Carolina, and NC State. And even prior to that, USC. The growth, I think, from here on out, it should be an upward type of trajectory. But when you have a generational player like Caitlin Clark, and hearing, admittedly, I didn't watch really any or many games early on in the women's tournament, not a ton from the men's tournament either, even though I do work from home and it's easy to just turn, games on from noon to midnight those first 2 days of the tournament. It's tough for me usually to follow without having a rooting interest. I don't do the brackets. I don't gamble on college basketball, and I don't really know many of the players. I don't know many of the women's players as well, but I know of Paige Beckers at UConn. More about Caitlin Clark. USC has, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but a very talented freshman. South Carolina's team is basically all stars. Perfect season for them. Where this needs to carry over, though, if there's not going to be the star power, and it's not just how talented she is, but, watching the game, Caitlin Clark has the basketball on a string. She's a fantastic, she's a shooting guard, can play point guard as well. Her vision, her court vision, passing half or 3/4 of the court, hitting her teammates in stride for fast break transition baskets. It's a thing to behold. And of course, points scoring, the all-time point scoring leader for men's or women's, passing Pistol Pete Maravich. So forgetting that title, she is awesome to watch. It's not to say that there are not other very, very talented women's college basketball players. There obviously are. But this was a different level that people wanted to tune in to. I hope women's college basketball continues to highlight their stars, putting their stars at the forefront. Again, if there's not going to be a generational player like Caitlin Clark, give as much promotional airtime, as much visibility as you can to your stars on your big teams. And college, women's college basketball, you probably only have 5 or 6 teams that could realistically either make a Final Four or win a national championship. It is extremely, extremely top heavy, which I don't think is something that's hurting ratings, that people aren't going to tune in to, watch. UConn's a perennial power. South Carolina, Iowa was in the championship the past 2 years, going back to the days of Pat Summitt coaching Tennessee. Notre Dame, has had some decent teams recently. Oregon was a pretty good team when Sabrina Ionescu was there. But it's not a sport where you're going to have a Cinderella. And I think the lowest rated seed to ever make a women's Final Four was, and I have this on my phone, I should have jotted it down, I think it was either like a 7, 8, or 9, and it's only happened once. Then in terms of Final Four appearances or championships, if you're not a 1, 2, or 3 seed, you have no shot. Historically, literally, if you're not a 1, 2, or 3 seed, you have no shot. So that should guarantee the viewer that once you get to the Elite Eight and the Final Four, you're watching the big teams. You're watching the big guns in women's college basketball. And that should be bringing in more eyes to the set. But attendance could be better, right? Especially, pro games. And we'll see Caitlin Clark going to Indiana with the number 1 pick. We'll see, people were, it was appointment television when Caitlin Clark was playing, and she was selling out arenas left and right. We'll see what that carryover is into the WNBA. But again, for folks that are big proponents of women's sports, and I'm one of them, women's college basketball especially, go. It's easy to say that you're into something, or athletes should be paid more, or should get more recognition, a bigger piece of the pie, all that stuff. You as a fan, we need to do our part. You need to watch, you need to go, you need to buy the merchandise. And there's only so many Caitlin Clarks in the world, and Angel Reese, probably going to be a top 5, top 3 pick coming out of LSU. There's only so many of them. This is not a league like the NBA where essentially every team has a recognizable star or two. But hopefully women's college basketball and the WNBA will get there. But real fast, more thoughts about the Final Four. There were 2 UConns in the Final Four, right? Men's and women's. Men's won the national championship. The women's lost to Iowa in the Final Four. Nobody cared about NC State. There were 2 NC States in the Final Four, right? There was the 11th seed that lost to Purdue in the men's bracket. And I forget what the seed was in the women's bracket that got totally annihilated by South Carolina. So interesting year where you had 2 universities both fielding men's and women's Final Four teams, but obviously much more prominence, notoriety given to UConn than to NC State. UConn for the men just rolled through everybody. I think it was only Alabama that lost by less than 10. But the largest total point differential in NCAA tournament history at 140 points. And a final thought, on the women's game, I was trying to get my 11-year-old son to watch the UConn-Iowa game and the championship game, and he didn't seem interested. I guess it's because he doesn't know the players. But I'm, telling him it's a more enjoyable game to watch than certainly the NBA. And maybe men's college basketball to a point, because there's passing, there's cutting, they're playing basketball. No one's really dunking, right? There's maybe 1 or 2 players in college that can dunk women's college basketball. there's ball movement, right? And, there's no real hero ball that you see in the NBA where, a ball dominant guard will just dribble down the shot clock and shoot. Other than Caitlin Clark, and then shooting her 45, 50 foot, 3-pointers. There's more, I think, that, aspiring basketball players, boys and girls, grammar school, middle school, high school can learn from women's college basketball, women's pro basketball than the comparable men's side. I will say, for whatever it's worth, I like the 4 quarters that women's college basketball plays instead of 2 halves. So men's college still doing 2 20-minute halves. Women's move to 4 10-minute quarters. Mathematically, same thing, right? I don't know. I like the quarters. I like the quarters better. But the one thing, and this is just an objective comment. This isn't hating by any means. I'm going to get into the next section. It's not hating. I'm just giving opinions and thoughts. Women's college basketball, though, even with the upper echelon teams, feels like the game is too sloppy at times. Sloppier more often than it needs to be. I'm not saying every possession or every other possession is sloppy. Don't misunderstand. But watching these games, high-end teams, UConn, Iowa, South Carolina, USC, it was amazing how sloppy things got on, drives to the basket, jumpers that just went off the backboard and didn't hit rim. It felt at times, not the majority of the time, let me clarify, but at times like a pickup basketball game you would see on a court by your house. Now, the vast majority of time, exquisite, precise, backdoor cuts, dribbling, give and goes, beautiful basketball. But I was surprised to see I can't think of a word other than sloppy, just how the game just felt sloppy more than I thought it would. I was expecting, there's going to be people diving on the ground, steals, blocked shots. That's not sloppy. Those are fantastic plays that defenders are making, or offensive players, hustle plays that people are making. But when it feels like it's just a bit disorganized and a bit of a mess, that was a bit surprising to me throughout the handful of games toward the end of the tournament that I watched. Now let's stay in college and women's sports. And this week, the NAIA banned transgender women in college sports. So the NAIA is the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics. They oversee more than 83,000 athletes at over 200, mostly smaller colleges and universities. And they rolled out a new policy that bans transgender women from competing in women's sports, making it the first major college sports governing body in the U.S. to do so. This was voted on by the organization's Council of Presidents 20-0 to approve the policy, which will take effect August 1st. All students, including trans men and trans women, will be allowed to compete on men's teams, according to the policy. And here was an interesting, thing, doing some research that I found. So going back 13 years, since 2011, the NCAA allowed trans women to compete on women's sports teams if they underwent 1 year of testosterone suppression. But then the NCAA changed that policy in January of 2022 following controversy over Leah Thomas, a trans University of Pennsylvania swimmer who won a number of races early in her season and went on to win an NCAA championship. The NCAA then adopted a sport-by-sport approach that determines eligibility based on guidelines set by the national or international governing body of each sport. All right, so that's a lot to take in before we get into, my thoughts on that. Like it happens in life in other things, it takes one event, one situation, one person, in this case, Leah Thomas, and this is going to sound like a harsh phrase, but I can't think of any other word for it, one incident, one situation, one person to ruin it for everyone else. And Leah Thomas being so dominant swimming at UPenn caused the NCAA to relook at their, transgender policy in terms of athletics, and they've tweaked it. Now, there are not a large, overwhelming number of trans women looking to or competing in women's sports at, at a major level across, let's say, D1, D2, and D3. I know there's no D2 anymore, but that subdivision and D3, I went to a D3 school. The number that I found was, and this could have been just for D1, I apologize, less than 40 or right around 40. So these rules right now, we're not even talking about the prospective, freshmen that are coming into university in September that may be trans, that may want to go out for a basketball team or a swimming or volleyball, field hockey, whatever it may be, ice hockey, whatever it may be. This is not an overwhelming, alarmingly large number of trans women that this is affecting. But if it affects one, it's worth having the discussion, right? Because then it's going to get into equality and discrimination. And there's going to be people obviously on both sides of the fence. Now, the flip side is, what's the main issue with this? At its most elementary way to describe it, it's having people that used to be men with certain muscle growth and hormones, regardless of how long you're suppressing testosterone with therapy, you still have a decade or 15 years, or however many years after puberty of filling out your biological body as a male. And that cannot be erased overnight. Nor can it be erased in a couple months or a year or 1 year of testosterone suppression therapy. It leads to a physical disadvantage. Now, if you're having a 5'3" trans woman that wants to play basketball, that's still going to be part of this discussion if someone can or can't. But people maybe look at that and shrug their shoulders, right? Like, because women in college basketball are all at least 5'10", right? So if you have someone like a Spud Webb wanting to be a female, people may look at that and go, But what happens if someone built like LeBron James in high school, like 6'8", 6'10", 250, 270, like a Joel Embiid, who's like, 6'10", 6'11", or 7 foot, and he's like 275, 280. So what if that's the person that then transitions to be a woman? And that's the person that wants to play college basketball or volleyball. Wouldn't you look at that and go, I don't know if that's so fair. I don't know if I was a parent of a daughter that should have made a college basketball team or should have gotten playing time but didn't because of a 6'10", 270-pound guy who is now a female being allowed to make the team. Or someone who has the physique of a man swimming, collegiately against women. That's not to say that there are not, women swimmers that could beat male swimmers, women tennis players that could beat male tennis players, basketball players, whatever. I'm not saying that. But if you're honest, if you're going to look at this and just think about it, and people are saying, well, the science doesn't say this and the science doesn't say that. It's hard to make the case to me that it just doesn't feel right. And for everybody that is, and for folks that are on this, and especially for the trans athletes, that this is, difficult for them to feel like they're being excluded or discriminated against or whatever the right nomenclature is. And I might have used the right words just now. What about the biological females who stayed female? Why does it feel like why is the conversation, and it's usually amongst liberals because they're, some liberals just go off off the reservation with some of the things that they believe in and how strongly they speak about it. And I'm liberal about some stuff, and I'm conservative about some stuff, and I'm moderate about some stuff. But this is, I think, a thing that I can look at and go, doesn't smell right or fair, doesn't feel right or fair to the biologically at birth remaining females. Because what about them? Who's looking out for them? Who's looking out for making sure that they have an even and level playing field competing against others of their biological equal, their biological ilk? That's where I'm falling on this. And yes, if the number was around 40, the 40 or so transgender women, currently they're part of college athletics that who knows how the NIA and how the NAIA, even though it's for smaller colleges or universities, how the NCAA may expound upon their tweaked rules, tweaked in 2022, how it's going to affect them and how it's going to affect other trans women looking to participate in college sports. But I would also want to say, a couple things. And this first thing isn't meant to be said in like an offhanded, dismissive nature, but we have all been in situations in life, family, friends, jobs, government, there's probably other, I don't call it industries, but situations where something happens and someone says to you, well, life's just not fair sometimes. And again, I don't mean that to be dismissive, but this is a situation, I think, for transgender athletes where you may feel like it's not fair and you may be right, but your situation, your choice, we're going to call it a choice because no one is strapping these people down and changing their genders, right? This is their choice based on how they feel and what they identify with. I get it and I support it. But based on their choice, why should others, the vast majority of others, be not punished, but they're not? Why should you be more protected than them? Why should the vocal minority enjoy more rights and protections and stipulations and changing of rules or bending of rules or whatever it may be than the non-vocal minority? And I'm not saying one is more deserving of the other, but this is to me, in a way, a squeaky wheel gets the grease thing, or is trying to get the grease thing. But again, I go back to, listen, this was your choice. This is how you identify, and I fully support it. But your choice should not be impacting the competitive fairness of the vast majority of others. If you want to transition and compete in men's sports, that's still being allowed. Or I think some colleges or universities or sports are having like an open division or a transgender division. That's fine. Doesn't that feel more fair than you're competing against other transgender athletes versus you used to be a man, now you're transitioning to a female and you want to compete against people that have only ever been female? I get it. And there's good conversations to be had both sides. And regardless of maybe how I communicated it, maybe it wasn't the most eloquent thing in the world, I am not dismissive of it. I understand the importance of it. I understand the value of having a conversation on both sides. And just because I am not on the liberal, gotta protect, it's discriminating, does not mean I'm a hater at all. My opinion and how I view things in my outlook is just as relevant as anyone else's on either side of the stage here. And I'm going to conclude with, it made me think of the conversation. Let's go to Star Wars in Return of the Jedi, when after Luke finds out that Darth Vader is his father, Luke goes to Dagobah, visits Yoda. Yoda dies, disappears, confirms to Luke that Darth Vader is his father. Luke goes outside, and the ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi appears to him, and they have the conversation. Luke said, "Why did you lie?" Quick aside before we get into that, that is the first time in Star Wars film where Force ghosts can affect the physical world. And by that, I mean, when Luke and Obi-Wan are talking, they're both sitting on a log. They're both sitting on a tree that fell over. For Luke to sit on a tree, that makes sense. But for a ghost to sit on a tree, because a lot was made in The Last Jedi of Yoda was able to call down lightning and it struck the tree that had the books of the Jedi in it, et cetera, et cetera. Return of the Jedi set that precedent, folks. I'm a super geek, just wanted to let you know. But that conversation between Luke and Ben Kenobi was, remember Obi-Wan said, well, what I told you was true from a certain point of view. And Luke asks, well, a certain point of view? And I think Obi-Wan's response was, Luke, you'll find that many of the truths that we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. And that's what this is. That's what this situation is. How transgender athletes, those that ardently support and want them to be able to participate, and then folks on the other side that feel I am being put now at a competitive disadvantage because I'm competing against someone that used to be a man. Many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. That's why I think this is a fascinating situation, discussion. I see it from both sides, but I have a side. Does not make me a hater, just makes me have certain opinions through life experiences or what just feels right to me, and I'm just an N of one. But still fascinating nonetheless. You never want anybody ever to feel excluded. And obviously these are people that emotionally have gone through a lot with their transition. I get it. I really, really do. But they're not the only ones. You just have to remember, they are not making this decision and playing these sports in a vacuum, in a bubble. There are others that are being impacted as well. And they need just as much consideration and thought and protection as transgender athletes do. So now let's conclude on a bit more of a well, it wasn't an upbeat comic, but an upbeat note. Avengers versus X-Men. It was a 12-issue comic event that ran from 2012 to 2013. High-flying names in terms of the authors. Matt Fraction, Jason Aaron, Brian Michael Bendis, Ed Brubaker, and John Hickman. A veritable who's who of some of the top writers in comics 10 years ago and still today. So this whole story revolved around Hope Summers, who is the daughter of the character Cable, born in the future, brought to the present. With the X-Men, she is waiting. So now at this point, Jean Grey is dead in the comic books. Hope Summers is waiting for the Phoenix Force to possess her because she thinks that she can control it. Hope Summers, if I'm getting this right, was the first mutant born after the whole House of M event in which the Scarlet Witch spoke the words, "No more mutants," and mutants were gone for a bit, and mutants could not give birth to other mutants for a while. I haven't read that in years. I have it. But Hope Summers was the first mutant born after the House of M event was put right. So Hope Summers is waiting. The Phoenix Force is coming to Earth. They can sense it. But when it comes, it destroys, it consumes, possesses, and turns, the host body from the Phoenix into the Dark Phoenix, which happened to Jean Grey a couple of times. But Cyclops, leader of the X-Men, thinks that Hope Summers is their savior, that she's going to be their mutant savior. The Avengers catch wind of what's happening, and they don't want this to happen. They don't want another Phoenix event, because in some cases it could be a world-ending event. So they fly out to where the X-Men are stationed, an island called Utopia. And this is when they first battle. The Avengers are trying to kidnap Hope and keep her safe until they can figure out what they're going to do with the Phoenix Force that is, traveling through the galaxy on its way to Earth. Eventually, Hope sees that Cyclops is like a bit unhinged or a little bit too ardent about Hope Summers being the savior, and decides to leave with the Avengers. Skip ahead a couple issues when the Phoenix Force arrives near Earth. Now, everybody's basically on the moon at this point. Now the X-Men and the Avengers are on the moon fighting. Hope Summers is there. She is ready to take the Phoenix Force. Iron Man winds up going out, leaves the moon, goes to space, winds up creating this big Iron Man robot, if you want to call it that, to destroy the Phoenix Force energy, or at least slow it down or stop it, whatever. Best case scenario is destroy it. But he doesn't destroy the Phoenix Force. He splits it. He fractures it. And it winds up, and I'm not going to say who, it winds up inhabiting 5 X-Men or mutant characters that all have the power of the Phoenix, but they all have 1/5 of the power of the Phoenix because the Phoenix fractured. So they each have 20% of the Phoenix Force. In their battles with the with the Avengers, anytime a hero, one of these Phoenix characters falls, and by falls, I don't mean killed, but like beaten to a pulp, that Phoenix energy is released and given to the other 4. So now you have 4 X-Men characters with 25% of the Phoenix Force. And when another one falls, then you have 3 characters with 33%. So as you can see, this all leads up to a one person gets the Phoenix Force, and obviously they're able to save the person, fend it off, etc. At first, I thought it was going to be that this comic was going to be some sort of empty Royal Rumble. They actually, in the trade paperback, they list each issue as like round 1, round 2, round 3. So I made it feel like, oh crap, are they just going to be like beating the hell out of each other each round, and like, X-Men win a round and the Avengers and this, that, and the other thing. There was enough going on that made it interesting beyond that. And the best thing about this too, I think this is like a $40 comic, which probably sounds about right, like 12 issues. Say between a $30 and $40 comic. It might have been $34.99. I'll have to check after I'm done recording. But I wound up getting it at my local comic store. It was in like the discount bin for $10. I'm like, well, I'll essentially read anything for $10. And if I'm getting 12 comics for $10, that's a good read. So I would recommend it. Anybody listening to this that knows me, that thinks it's interesting, wants to check it out, let you borrow it. No worries. But now I am next reading the OMAC Project, which is a DC compiled book where I'm thinking, I haven't read it yet. I'm halfway through the first issue, where I think Batman or someone winds up putting like a watcher in the sky called Brother Eye to keep tabs on all the heroes, because things at that point, again, we're going back like 15 years, was getting a little dicey in the DC universe. Wonder Woman killed somebody. The heroes weren't trusted. So someone wound up making like satellites or sentinel robots to keep track of the DC heroes. And I also picked up, and I haven't read it yet, the trade paperback of Secret Wars, not the original from the 80s, where the Venom costume, the Venom symbiote, the black Spider-Man costume was introduced. The Secret Wars from maybe, I don't even know when, 5-7 years ago. I'm going to check that out as well. And those will probably be reviews on subsequent podcasts. But for now, that will conclude the podcast for today. Like always, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to make us part of your listening routine. We're up to episode 8 of Shogun on FX. If you have not checked that out, please decide to do so. Today's Wednesday that I'm recording this, which means the next episode of X-Men 97, the cartoon, and Star Wars The Bad Batch released on Disney+. Both very good seasons so far. I would recommend checking that out if you have any inclination. And so we're done with college basketball. The NBA is in its home stretch. Baseball just started. The UFL, United Football League, the merger of the XFL and USFL, is underway as well. And MLS, I went to my first MLS game last year, saw a Red Bulls game. And as the weather's turning, I think I want to get out there. It's a really good experience, easy drive. Tickets are affordable. Harrison, New Jersey, really cool stadium as well. But whatever you're doing, wherever you're living, hoping you're having nice weather. And as always, hoping that you are staying happy, staying safe, and staying healthy. And we will talk soon. Next podcast, we're going to be going over linebackers, safeties, and cornerbacks that the Niners could be targeting in the draft that is going to be 2 weeks from tomorrow. Take care, everybody.